Deliver us from evil. We have a problem with evil. I don't mean all the philosophical baggage that academics like to think about, how a good God can allow evil, does it exist, etc. I mean the everyday way in which we understand evil and how we use the word in our day-to-day language. We call some people evil. We call acts that are so extreme as to be beyond the bounds of normal decency evil. Shoplifting may be wrong, but we would never call it evil in the way that, say, torture is. We use the word so that we think of evil as something that can be categorized as extreme. The words deliver us from evil set up an image of a deliverance ministry. Perhaps that conjures up for us scenes from The Exorcist and other films which we think of as horror. And the reason that it brings up all these images is because we don't really believe that we see evil in its raw, unadulterated ferocity all that often. So what are we to make of the fact that these words deliver us from evil are part of a prayer that we are taught as being the backbone of our prayer life? It is easy to understand that our prayer life needs to be used to constantly remind us about God and his character. Asking for our needs on a daily basis to the one who sustains us makes sense. Asking that we would not be led into temptation in a world that, as Sally has reminded us, is stuffed full of temptations, is sensible. And all these things we do with the Lord's Prayer. But praying regularly that we would be delivered from some brutal person or appalling act of evil doesn't seem to fit with the experience of our everyday lives. Evil, from the way that we define it, is something we don't see very often. So we say the words of this prayer, but what do we make of them? Jesus seems to be suggesting that evil is all around us. So does Paul, in the passage we've had read from Ephesians, putting on all that armour, belt, breastplate, shoes, shield, sword, to ward off evil? It seems quite exhausting for something we barely register in our daily lives. This line of the Lord's Prayer challenges us to think differently about how evil shows itself in this world and in our lives. It challenges us to lose the preconceptions we form so that we can pray this line of the prayer in the way that Jesus would want us to. So how do we think about evil? Well, we need to look at the fact that we often call people evil. In films, the good hero may carry the story, but we really go because we're fascinated by the baddie. Cinematic history is full of them. Take just two of the more famous ones. Darth Vader was introduced to us in 1978 via his creepy, heavy breathing and shadowy, unsettling presence, and he's represented as pure evil throughout that first Star Wars film. The Joker, our second example, is Batman's nemesis, again represented as pure evil, appearing from nowhere with no philosophy other than to do evil, break laws, and cause mayhem. Sadly, of course, we don't have to look only to fictional films to see people we consider as evil. 9 days ago, Jake Davidson killed 5 people in Plymouth before finally killing himself. And even more sadly, that's only the latest act in a list that is far too long of people we could call evil because of what they have done. But we have to ask the question, are these people really what we would call evil? There is a tendency today to explain people's actions in terms of external reasons, to find triggers that are responsible for their actions. I described the Joker as pure evil, but a couple of years ago, a controversial film came out called Joker. The idea that the Joker simply liked to do evil was discarded in favour of a backstory that suggested he did this and turned out like he did because he was formed by the traumas of his life. Providing an explanation does seem to take away the idea of evil. And yes, that's fictional. Yet when we look at the faces of those who have committed such acts of genocide, mass murder, torture or abuse, we often look for explanations and reasons, maybe concentrating on significant traumatic events in their lives. Maybe you feel that doing this is letting people off the hook, or means we are trying to avoid putting blame on that person. These are weighty issues for us to think about in a short sermon. So there is just one thing that I want to draw out that's important to our understanding of evil for the Lord's Prayer. Accusing someone of being evil, quite simply, removes the possibility of redemption for that person. Evil cannot be redeemed. It is the opposite of God. But God the Father sent his Son Jesus to redeem the whole of humanity. We all make or greater or lesser responsibility of how we're shaped. Some of us will have had harder times than others, but all of us have choices to make. But ultimately, none of us are evil because we can all be redeemed. Let me just take another example to underline this point. To go back to Star Wars, by the end of the third film, Darth Vader has been rescued by Luke, his son, who has come to believe that good had not died in him, that he was not pure evil. Okay, this is using a film to make that point, but every person by God can be redeemed, though accepting it may be another matter. But Jesus does not tell us to pray to be delivered from evil people. He tells us to pray to be delivered from evil, or the evil one, as a number of translations have it. And in the end, there is only one being who is irredeemably evil, and that is Satan. The word Satan or the devil may throw up images for us, mostly I suspect rooted in the fevered imagination of many medieval scholars, which involves horns, tails and pitchforks, and makes something of a caricature, and therefore it's difficult to think of being delivered from that image or what that means. So if it isn't people or comical pitchforks, then what are we asking to be delivered from? The book of Genesis, where our first reading came from, contains many wicked acts, and they also have a very modern ring to them. Here's just a small selection. Murder. Cain murders his brother Abel. Offering women as sex slaves. Lot does this with his family. Chapter 19, if you don't believe me. Incest. Lot's daughters. Identity theft. Jacob tricks his brother out of his inheritance. Trafficking. Joseph's brothers sell Joseph into slavery and then lie to their father that he's died. You get the point. And that's what we think of when we think of being delivered from evil. We think of Satan's involvement in evil in the world and think it's big stuff. Those acts surely are worthy of the spiritual forces of evil arraigned against us. And yet the first story that we read in Genesis, where the serpent talks to Adam and Eve about eating from the fruit of the tree of knowledge, it's just not as obviously evil as the list I've just read out to you. It doesn't come with a glowing neon light flashing evil at us. If it did, we'd have plenty of time to run away from it. It was just a discussion over interpreting God's instructions. That's how Adam and Eve missed the flashing neon sign. There wasn't one. And only when God called to them did they understand that there was a problem. And by then it was too late. For us, most of the time, evil is not an active, malicious force. It is simply an absence of good. Goodness was what was missing from the conversation with the serpent. Adam and Eve missed the fact that the argument was not about the fruit or what it offered. It was about the relationship with God. In this sense, evil as an absence of good is always around us. It can simply mean sowing the seeds of mistrust in a community, accusing or judging others with no thought, having no care for the truth, or watching injustices unfold and doing nothing about it. Evil is very ordinary indeed. Ultimately, it's about whether we recognise God for who he is or not. Whilst we're right to grade the wrongs that happen in this world, with truly atrocious acts receiving our greatest revulsion, we do ourselves no favours if we don't recognise that our world is a constant battle between good and evil, fought at every level. And it's not a battle of evil people against good people. It's a battle within ourselves. That isn't to say that we must view everything that comes our way with suspicion or mistrust and treat everything as a battle. Nor should we be putting up the barriers and shutting out the world around us. That isn't the life that Jesus calls us to. He calls us to a life lived with the openness that only the love of God can bring, one without fear or blame. But the line of this prayer does remind us that to live like that will leave us vulnerable and open to evil in its most trivial of forms. If we live our lives the way Jesus wants us to,